Hi, friends. This is Emily. I'm the owner and founder of Friendly City Books. And today I'm excited to be joined by author Anya Liftig, who wrote a memoir called Holler Rat. Anya, thanks for coming on the show today.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. Well, it's fun to see you again because we first met Anya last year at the Mississippi Book Festival. And she was on a panel talking with some other authors from her publishing house, Abrams Press. And she was just so cool because she walked up to our booth in this, I remember you were wearing this denim jumpsuit with all these patches on it. And you had all these fun trinkets, like postcards and bookmarks and stickers and buttons and all this just fun freebies. And we just really enjoyed talking with you. So I was really excited that you wanted to join us on the podcast.
Yeah, I definitely came prepared with swag. I did a lot of handmade swag for the book rollout. So, yes,
Yeah.
I'm glad you were an early beneficiary of it.
Yeah, that was really fun. And my mom and my aunt also went to your panel and they thought you were fantastic.
Oh, that's so nice. Oh, that's great to
Yeah.
hear.
So after the book festival, I listened to Holler Rat on audiobook, and you did the audiobook for that. What was that process like?
That was a very interesting process. I had initially, I have a performance background, but I've never done an audiobook. And I was initially, I sort of was really eager to do it, and then I sort of backed off. And when I heard the actor that they were sort of thinking about having do it, read it, I immediately knew that I had to be the one to tell my story. And I particularly there were certain things like, there's my grandmother has a very heavy accent, a very sort of specific East Kentucky accent, and I was just like, I don't think that anybody's going to be able to really get it. So I did I auditioned for my own audiobook, and was lucky to get the job of playing myself in my own audiobook. And it was very intense. It was really a very different way to experience the writing. And, there were certainly moments where I was reading it as a script and thinking, who wrote this? Who did this? Like, why did they put in so many difficult words to say? And, there was definitely an element of criticism, but there was also a way in which I was able to get close to the text in a different way than I had when I was sort of writing it. And it felt like I was able to, in the audiobook form, think about the listener as sort of somebody I was sort of telling secrets to, and somebody that I was like up late at night sort of whispering with. And so I really loved the idea of having that element of the experience of the kind of performance of the book, in addition to the element on the page. I think it really helped me kind of feel very connected to readers, to listeners. So.
Yeah. So, okay, here's a question kind of that came to mind as you were answering that. Um, because there are some very personal parts of the book, did you find yourself, was it hard to read, or did you kind of disassociate when you were reading?
Well, I mean, I think the question of disassociation in, memoir, when you're revealing something so personal, oftentimes is a valid one. I think that probably because I had performed some and used some elements of what is in the memoir as text and performance at various points when I was reading it. So I had a little bit of experience of having been in public and reading these things. I think there was definitely some disassociation that was happening. I think it's sort of the sound and the veil of text kind of allows you to sort of hide behind a curtain a little bit. But there were also moments, I think, in the audiobook booth where I felt very private and felt very much like I was really with myself. And that really allowed me to kind of come out of that. So I think the experience of the audiobook process, where you're in this tiny little booth, or at least I was in a tiny little booth with a big microphone in front of you, but essentially just reading to yourself quietly, did allow me to kind of have a lot of vulnerability, and to let some of those moments that are more vulnerable kind of live as such.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And, so it's not always common that the author gets to read their own audiobook. And it's not always common that the author gets to have input on the cover. But you are on the cover with a childhood photograph. So can you talk a little bit more about that too?
Yeah, I was, I think I was very lucky in that my publisher, Abrams, is an art press, and is really well known for its art publications. And so I think that and I also am lucky in that I had a few photographs of mine published inside the book as well. So they were, I think very open to visual ideas as well. So I was allowed to have input on the cover, and also they were very open about seeking materials from me that might be able to be used in the cover or in, some of the graphic design elements. And the picture on the cover is actually a moment that I don't remember from being a kid, but I remember the photograph existing for much of a long time. And the larger photograph, it's a small picture of a larger photograph, which is me in this as the head of a scarecrow in the sort of very, very large potato field at my grandmother's house, at my mama's house in Kentucky. And I'm on my mom's shoulders. And my dad is actually the one who took the photograph. And, and it was always something that I saw that was always this funny moment that my parents had kind of captured of just like, oh, let's put her on our shoulders. She'll be the scarecrow. And I always, thought about it as this moment before my sister was born, this moment that sort of, for me, it was like on the precipice of the time when I started remembering things. So it was like this moment in sort of my pre-memory, but really on the cusp of it. Mm-hmm. And I really also, with the book, I really wanted the book to have the cover, to have the feeling of it having been handled by an artist. So that's why it has that kind of, handwritten element to it. It has, if you look up close on it, it has like squiggles and lots of like sort of crossouts, and sort of, it looks like very much like it's been handled. The photograph has been handled. And so I was very excited that the designers really listened to that kind of conceptual element that I was hoping for when the design of the cover.
Yeah. So you mentioned the timing of this photograph being before your sister was born. So you're still an only child then.
Mm-hmm.
But also, one of the biggest themes, or, in the first part of the book in your childhood, is around an injury that you had as a child. And was this before or like during that? Could you kind of place it and describe what happened?
Yes, so this was before that, and I would say that I have, as many survivors of childhood trauma have, also, I share this in common with them. I don't have that many memories before age 6, which is when I had a botched hernia operation, and the doctor who performed the hernia operation was high on cocaine when he did it, and that caused him to, his ailment caused him to suture my femoral nerve with some sutures. And so I unfortunately lost the use of my right leg for quite a while, for 6.5 months primarily was when, and then, I was very lucky to have had a revolutionary reconstructive surgery, and to then start to be able to gain slowly the use of my leg back. But yes, I really don't have too many memories beforehand. And that's one of the reasons why a photograph like that, I think why I stared at photographs like that so much when I was a kid, was because I was sort of like, do I remember this? Do I not remember this? And still why, now the sort of line between photography, between what was photographed and what is actually in my memory, at this point is actually quite hazy. It was one of the reasons why I think I fell in love with photography a little bit later on in life, and became a photographer.
Yeah. Well, one thing that really hasn't left me after reading your memoir was not only, did you have the surgery go wrong, but it was really hard to read that the surgeon did not believe you and did not believe your parents and push back on that. And I felt like in your telling this story, you really become an advocate for listening to the patient, no matter the patient's age. And I think there was an excerpt of that part of the book in Slate, maybe online.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
was a very powerful, call for patient advocacy. But I hate that, you had that experience.
Yes. And I think that at the time, I mean, it's at the time, and this is the early 80s, it was, I mean, I hate to say, oh, it was a different time, but it was, my parents were doing what they had been taught, which was listen to the doctor. The doctor knows everything. The doctor's an expert, oh, what does the doctor say? And I came from a culture of, on my father's side, doctors and dentists who were, authorities. And, if you were a doctor, that meant that you knew stuff. And so I think that there was, a less of a sort of element of we should question this. And I think that especially being so little, it was in just sort of developing the words, the feeling of the doctor's not doesn't believe you, your parents don't believe you. Really, nobody believes you. Do you believe you? Like the trying to convince myself that what I knew to be true in myself was not true because nobody was going to acknowledge it. Was a very, very profound experience and certainly has had reverberated throughout my life.
Yeah. Well, luckily you were able to have procedures that, healed your leg and you were
Mhm.
able to, regain the use of your leg, but also actually became a professional dancer. So I really want to talk about that too, because I wanted to be a professional dancer when I was a little girl. And when I read in the book that you danced with the Martha Graham Company, I like had to stop. And I was like, no way, because Martha Graham was like my idol when I was young. So can you kind of go behind the curtain? Like, what was that experience like? And I mean, I remember there's one part in the memoir where you talk about how you still like take the train every day from Connecticut into New York City to go to dance practice. And I was like, oh, what a dream.
Well, if you ride Metro North, you might not think it's quite a dream, but it yes, and I was I danced with on scholarship at the Martha Graham School, and then I was with a teenage ensemble, so I wasn't with the full company traveling around the world. I just want to make that clear. But I mean I think that the story of it, has does sound like, oh, she had this terrible thing. She lost it, lost the use of her leg almost completely, and then she, became this dancer. It wasn't, it wasn't willingly, at least at first. Certainly for the first few years, it was that. I had to, after my initial 2 years of really intense physical therapy with physical therapists and going to facilities, I had to choose some type of activity that could do very intensely and could do basically on a daily basis. And my choices were playing travel soccer, which is like a sport akin to absolute godliness and holiness in Fairfield County, Connecticut, or the other choice was dancing, which involved music and didn't involve talking much or much socializing. So that was the clear winner. And, I actually at first didn't really enjoy it very much. But I did it because my parents told me to, and I was, still having trouble with my leg. So, my dancing and the rigor with which I danced was not born out of, at the beginning, was not born out of any type of real love or passion for it. It was born out of a necessity and of really kind of keeping my doctors happy. But through that rigor and through, the intensity with which I had to do it, I really then discovered, wow, there's this whole other world that is beyond the world of my middle school. And there are people who are performing and they're on stage, and there's like it was sort of an escape from the things that were going on the playground. And I was a very introverted kid, and it was really wonderful that you didn't have to talk and you could just perfect technique. The idea that there was technique and there were these levels that you could gain, and you could work your way up a chain, and the whole idea of looking at principal dancers in a company and thinking about a trajectory, and it was just a total revelation to me. So I think that dancing, really seeing that there were people who devoted their lives to art in a way that I had never really, contemplated before, was just amazing. And I was I'm very grateful that I'm grateful to myself. I'm grateful to my parents that they made the sacrifices required to get me to dance class every day, which wasn't easy because it was far away to make that
Yeah.
happen. So,
Well, I have another dance question just
yeah.
because I got really excited about it. So, here where I've grown up in Mississippi, every kid takes like ballet, tap, jazz, maybe lyrical, but no one, it's rare to actually take a real modern class at a young age. Like maybe if you continue dancing in college, you might start getting into like what is traditionally known as modern dance. So can you talk a little bit about, for someone who may not be familiar with like what modern dance is and what makes it unique from other forms of dance?
Sure. Well, I came out of ballet. I came out of Balanchine Ballet, and around age 14, I sort of had to take the bitter pill that my body was just not developing in a way. I was developing a bust and a butt, and not necessarily in a way that was going to be attractive to any ballet company in the world. And that was just a fact that I needed to confront. Modern dance, particularly American modern dance, of which Martha Graham is one of the founders, is really something that is more, I guess I would say, more angular, more sort of more you where ballet the body is turned out and is often like dealing with extension and length. Modern dance can sometimes be sort of seen as more turned in, more muscular, more aggressive. It really more wouldn't want to say that it's more athletic, because there's really very few things that are more athletic than ballet, but is a more a guttural type of dance. And in many ways, I would say it's a more emotional and sort of raw form of dance. And there are many different techniques of modern dance. I'm very lucky that Martha Graham herself didn't start really dancing until her early 20s. So a lot of the things that we think of, the dance is very, I wouldn't, it's in no way feminine, but it is very like womanly. And that was what I really loved. It was also much more forgiving of different body types, and it's much more embracing of different body types, because it's much more about, I would say, muscular strength in many ways, a different type of muscular strength. So yeah, really, and another thing that's very different between particularly Martha Graham and some of the ballet traditions that are in the United States is that her iconography dealt a lot with mythology, and deals a lot with mythology and deals a lot with literature. And so because I was just at age 14 sort of starting to study that stuff and get really into that, particularly a lot of like images of like really crazy women like Clytemnestra and Medea and like all of these things, I was really, really attracted to the Graham technique.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I always thought of modern as being like very physical, but like in a strong kind of like demonstrating strength, and not that ballet doesn't, but it is more maybe confrontational sort of, like,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. There's also different types of partnering work in terms of, two dancers come together to work together. It's a different sort of dynamics at play. So I mean, you can think of I think someone once described Martha Graham as looking like she was going to give birth to a cube, which is which I think is good, sums it up pretty well.
That's funny. Well, I also think, and of course, I've only read about this. I've never seen it, but her, there's a dance that she created, or a performance she created, where it was about grief, and she's like wrapped up in this like knit
Lamentation.
lamentation. Thank
Yeah.
you. Grief. Yes, lamentation, and she's wrapped up in this like knit like tube, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she's basically, I mean, it's almost like she is like rebirthing herself out of this tube to emerge from
Yes.
her grief. But so when you were describing birthing a cube, it made me think of that particular work.
Yes, and that work is really interesting because the image of being of a tube of fabric. I was just at the Tate Modern in Britain, and the tube of fabric is something that the Yoko Ono show is there now. Is a sort of image that has been used in performance many times. But I would say that and Yoko Ono has a performance that has to do with being inside a tube of fabric. I don't remember the title of the piece. I don't know if it's called Tube, but it definitely can recall that piece, that iconic piece of Martha Graham's, which is Lamentation. And one of the beautiful things about that piece is just the fabric is like extending the gestures and really sort of making seen these making visible the forms of the movement in a way that you kind of you without the fabric you could imagine but not really be made tangible. So that's such an iconic piece. I was very lucky to go to a performance where they did Lamentation, but they had three different people doing it simultaneously, so it was very cool to see it coming about. But yes, I believe that piece was about the grief of the Spanish Civil War. I might be wrong, but I believe I have to look it up again.
Yeah, that would make, just given the time period. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. So, okay. So you had this teenage years of commuting to New York and dancing. And then you decided to go to college at Yale, which was kind of in your backyard and somewhere you'd been very familiar with because of your recovery as a child from the surgery. But like, why Yale? And like, but also like, how did, what was your decision process? And then how was the experience for you?
Going to Yale was one of those things where I wanted to go to Yale because I knew that they had a tremendous theater and art program. Unfortunately, Yale did not have any type, at that time, did not have any type of dance program. And, was really debating whether I wanted to try to stay in the city and go to Columbia and continue dancing at Graham. At the time, the Graham Company was in many shades of disarray. It wasn't that long after Graham had died, and there were a lot of financial troubles. And, it was the choice between, I mean, it's a crossroads that I revisit all the time in terms of, should I have, delayed going to college? Should I have not gone to college? Should I have stuck with dancing? Or should I have gone to college, but also, maybe not have decided to go to New Haven. For a while, when I did go to New Haven, I did try to commute to the city, which was for class, which was a terrible idea. But I did go to Yale because it was Yale. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it was the best school I got into, and I was a little sort of stunned that I got in. And so I went there because because it was Yale, and also because I associated it as a place of healing, and as a place where it was close to home. It was 25 minutes away if you drove pretty fast. And I think that my experience there, because I actually, now my day job is I help students with their college process and with their college selection. And I see now how much more goes into creating a good fit between a student and a school. For me, I think I didn't really consider much of what was the fit. I was just like, what is the hardest school to get into? And I think that had I sort of thought about, what type of environment do I actually want to be with? What type of students do I want to be with? I don't know that I would have chosen Yale. I think that overall, it was a tough time. It was a tough time. I was not prepared, even though I went to an excellent public school, and I grew up in a very, I would say, glamorous community, although not in a very sort of glamorous household in that community. I was honestly unprepared for that level of wealth, that level of, legacy, that level of just kind of American aristocracy that there was. And the traditions that were at Yale, I did my best at integrating into them, but it was awkward. It was awkward. And I don't think that I ever really got into a groove there in 8 semesters. I never really found my real sweet spot. The best times that I had there were when I was making art. And I'd say that, I didn't really, I had emotionally, it was a tough time. Emotionally, it was a tough time.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, making art as an outlet, and you describe in the book how your photography blossomed during your college years. Was that something you were doing as a hobby before, or, what was the development of that art form for you?
Yeah, I always thought, my parents had they had a Pentax K1000 camera that they had photographed with me with when I was a little kid, and my sister with when we were little kids. And my grandfather had, my Jewish grandfather in Connecticut had a couple really serious cameras that I knew were required you to know stuff to use them. So I'd grown up around people who used cameras and were somewhat fluent in them, but I was never particularly interested in them until the end of high school. And my very last semester in high school, I'd done most of my credits, and I really wasn't going to school very much. I was mostly in the city dancing, but I did take a photography class, and I really loved it. In college, one of the things that, because I wasn't dancing, I sort of had this very large empty hole in my life that I was trying to fill with lots of different things. And I took photography at Yale, and that really, it didn't fill the hole. It sort of shaped the hole differently, I think. I really just went all in for it right away. And I would say that photography definitely was sort of the joy of my college years. And I went from taking it my first semester, sophomore year. I took it, I doubled up on it. I ran the dark room in my undergraduate college. I was, every night you would find me in the dark room until late at night, just printing. And I did, photo editor of this, photo editor of that. I was just really obsessed with the strangeness of the fact that you could you could capture light on a piece of plastic and then reproduce it on a piece of paper. It was just so bizarre. It still is bizarre to me, in the most magical way.
Well, so speaking of that, I mean, how do you feel about digital photography? I mean, is it, do you do it, or are you just like analog all the way? Like you want to be in the dark room? Like, how do you feel about this divide?
Yeah, I mean, I did eventually go to graduate school for photography, and I was right on the cusp of the analog digital divide, such that we had half of our class was digital and half of our class was analog. So I never really. I now shoot in digital. I now am all, I recognize I recognize the need for efficiency and the need to get things done. So I do work in digital, but I've never found anything that replaced that feeling of the analog photography, or the feeling of being in the dark room, or even the camaraderie of the dark room is something that I really just miss. Is being up late with a group of people, the strange humor that develops over when you're saturated with those chemicals for hours at a time.
Yeah, and you
So
think of the red light in the
yeah,
room. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Just a strange, this very, it was a very communal experience, and I think that is missing from the digital experience for me. So I've never enjoyed, digital. For me involves sending things out to be printed. It doesn't involve the dark room, which to me is, was so satisfying, especially I think at Yale, where I was really struggling to not to find my people, but to kind of find an emotional anchor. So the darkroom was really a place of discovery for that.
Yeah. Well, just to share, like, my uncle's story, he's a photographer. He was the first person I knew who was a professional artist. Like, he's in
Mm,
my family, he actually made his living doing photography, and he was for a long time like very committed to film only.
mm.
And then I grew up on the Gulf Coast, and when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, he lost everything. All his negatives were gone, like everything was gone. So ever since then, he has been, a digital because of that experience.
Yeah.
But last time I saw him, he brought in this new project that he's working on. And maybe this is kind of like a little bit of a return to analog. He started doing this thing where he's printing on vellum, or like
Mm.
developing images on vellum and then using like a shadow box to illuminate them.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
yeah, I guess
So
one of those,
yeah.
like, old technology comes back around.
Interesting. Wow. Gosh. I mean, that's always the fear of the great fear of a photographer, any artist, is just that the physical object will be lost. And it is one of the things about performance that is, we'll talk about performance in a little bit, but that is so kind of appealing in a way, is that it's already lost. Like you've planned for it to be gone, right? You've planned, either you're there or you're not. So, I mean, I think that idea of the artifact and the documentation and how something is preserved is so interesting in terms of artwork. And digital is also, I mean, digital also has its own ways of degrading and changing, and so I think but for me, I think I'm an analog girl. So I'm a 20th century kid. So.
Yeah, but okay, this is actually the perfect segue, I think, to performance, because exactly what you described, this dichotomy of, an object that can last, quote unquote, forever versus something that is ephemeral in
Mhm.
nature. I mean, so that's quite a big change to make in your point of view as an artist. Um, and in your chapters and essays about going to your MFA program, you could kind of see this develop where you start changing from one discipline to the other. But can you talk more about what led you to that, down that path?
Yeah, I actually would say that I don't know. I think now I can see that I think they have a lot in common. I mean, photography, particularly analog photography, is, actually incredibly ephemeral. I mean, what is it? It's really some, some silver, some incredibly thin silver on a piece of paper. That's what it is, and it's a chemical reaction, right? It's light and a chemical reaction. It's not, we can think about it, uh, and it's very ephemeral in the sense that it is a moment in time, right? And it's something that even just the so I was really interested in grad school in photography. I became really interested in the idea of what is a photograph, like what are you actually doing, and not so much about the end product. Like I think that I got really kind of, yeah, conceptually um, interested in the process of why would you photograph, what is this act that you're doing, and that idea of the action of photographing, and the idea of the making of it, became really interesting to me. And I think once I shifted my thoughts away from the output and more to the process, then, and once I sort of centered that idea of process, then all processes became really interesting to me. And performance is about exposing process. Performance is about, letting people see. You are literally letting people see the 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 art making as it happens, right? So it's not something that you hang on a wall and you say, oh wow, that's finished. Oh well, I wonder how they did this, and I wonder how they did that. Performance is something where you get to see all of the pieces laid out, and you get to watch something build, and you get to watch something grow. And so I think that I really became interested in the ways in which art and everyday life really merged together. And I think that that's really what was happening for me in grad school. And the jump between the two actually was, I would say, yeah, I had, at the end of my first year in grad school, I did. It's funny that we talked about lamentation. I did a piece. They had something called a drawing marathon, which was basically a 24-hour sort of experimental kind of artistic free for all. And I had this idea that I wanted to project family slides on my body and then move around in it. So I had a la lamentation, I had a white fabric tube, and I was going to, be sort of distorting these images with my body as I moved around. And the with this sort of idea of thinking about the distortion of time and memory, and very much connected to sort of what I was saying at the beginning of this about, not really being able to distinguish whether the photograph on the cover of the book is, memory or is it a photograph, right? Where is that line? And I did that, and one of my professors was there, and she said, "You know what you should do? You should do performance art." And I thought, what a terrible idea. This is a terrible idea. She has no idea what she's talking about. And I thought that, I had a lot of preconceived notions about that. I thought that performance artists were sort of mimes, or like Marcel Marceau, or like, like, I don't know. I thought they were honestly like dancers who didn't really do a good job. And but the more that I started to find out and read about it and sort of consider that my definition of performance art was incredibly limited, incredibly naive, incredibly, yeah, just lame. That really performance was really about process, and I started to think about that. It really started, and that performance could really be just an investigation of life made with intention. then I started to get really excited by it. And so by the time I entered graduate school with a very traditional black and white sort of precious photographs of East Kentucky that were made with a antique Rolleiflex camera and printed on, a warm tone sepia paper, and exited naked with a 2 hour performance naked in a gallery where I sat down, I stared at people for 20 minutes, didn't say anything, and then said, "Do you have any questions?" So I kind of, I really drank the juice of, the, exploring your artistic, development in graduate school. I think I
Yeah,
did what
well,
they told me. I did what they told me.
well, one question that kept coming up for me as I was reading about your development as an artist was this question around who decides what art is. Because one thing that I kind of gleaned from your experience showing your photographs in grad school, in the workshops, and like not getting great feedback is, well, I liked it. Why don't you like it? And performance really begs that question because, of course, people who it has this reputation among people who don't get it, that like, is it art? So, how would who decides what art is?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, I think that who decides what art is I mean, there's the answer of who should decide what art is. I mean, if I should it, I mean, I do think that it's a very personal thing, and I think that if it's something that speaks to an individual, then it's art. I think I have a very open definition of that. I think that, today the arbiters of who say this is art are, don't I don't necessarily agree with, the gatekeepers that say this is art, this is not. I don't think that we've got it right. I think that it really is a very personal thing, and I think that many it really is, if something is speaking to you and it's something that you feel like is you're connecting with, I think any individual has the right to say that it's art to them. I think that's something that's a right that we all have.
Yeah. The other thing that made me think of this too is I think one of the earlier performance pieces you described was trying to get into like the Armory show and like Art
Mm.
Basel, Miami, and stuff like this, and not getting in. And so, like, literally knitting yourself, like attaching yourself to the physical, like building or like a bench or, like a door or something. And of course, and now that I think about it, like there's something kind of Martha Graham about that. Like going back to lamentation, like physically like attaching yourself via fabric to something to make a statement. But that made me think of, well, who decides, like who gets into these institutions anyway? Um,
Well, Well, I think that, I have always struggled with, I think that performance art, because it exists, because it exists largely outside the systems of capitalism, outside the systems of any type of really outside most traditional art spaces, and really outside most traditional sort of ideas of art making. Even now when people say, "What do you do?" and I say performance art, people are, what is that? You're an actor? Are you, what does that mean? I think that performance art, because it is so on the outside, is one of the reasons that I really, really love it. And I've always been somebody who struggled with the art institution, whether it was, certainly with the Armory, and certainly with Art Basel, the feeling oppressed by the sort of mega art world system that, definitely does do the gatekeeping of saying this one is art, and definitely this is art, equaling this is something that can be sold, whereas this cannot be sold, or we will not sell this. I think is, something that I've struggled against. And in those performances, particularly right when I was out of grad school, a lot of it was about loneliness. And a lot of the work I was making was about loneliness and trying to like literally physically interject myself into spaces. And I can tell you that like, you know, I would go and I would try to like body weave myself into, you know, the armory show and be tripped over by people and people, you know, cursing at me of like, what is this, you know, foolish person doing on the ground, like wrapping themselves in string? Well, yes, it was a objectively pretty foolish thing to do in the middle of a crowded convention center. But also, it was this act of like, gosh, I feel like I'm out here alone, away from this is supposed to be my world. You know, these are supposed to be my people. This, you know, but the gallery system, all of this is so far from my experience, which is, you know, working 7 days a week just so that I can, you know, try to afford to stay in New York City so that I can occasionally once get an afternoon off to come and do something like this and then try to convince other people it's art, you know. So it was a very, I think those pieces were a lot about loneliness. But I think that, you know, being a artist, and I think a lot of performance artists really, you know, struggle against the institution and against institutions.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you were describing, you know, this one performance where you're kind of like weaving through this crowd at this art gallery and kind of rolling around and people not expecting it, you know, and so like having various reactions. And one thing you said in one of your essays about one of your performances is that you actually have all of the control. And it's up to you as the artist to determine how much control you want to let the audience have, and you can withhold it or offer it. And I just thought that was such an interesting insight, because I think that I can't remember exactly which essay it was about, but you know, in some of the performances you described, like you mentioned, like you're naked in them. And I think a lot of people would initially think that as a loss of control, but you frame it as actually complete and absolute control. So I thought that was a really interesting insight.
Well, you know, I think the idea of being naked in public really, you know, freaks people out. And I think the first time I did it, which is, you know, a rite of passage, I think for most performance artists, which is like, you know, the idea of bearing it all, the idea of letting everybody see the icky parts and the scars and the things that you normally hide or that you've hidden, you know, with your clothing for every day of your life up until that point, you know, is this sort of terrifying thing. But once you've done it, and you've done it a couple times, and you've done it a bunch of times, there is this way in which the fact that so many people are so terrified of it, and that you are become sort of habituated to it, does allow you to develop this real kind of strength from it, and does allow you to develop, I would say, yeah, a sense of control, because you can embody and sort of live in this place that and gain strength from a place that terrifies people. And I think that, you know, that position, and you know, and performance is a lot about hierarchies. Performance is a lot about the, you know, the performance audience connection, but also hierarchy. And you know, to me it's fascinating, because you are visually at your most vulnerable, but you are also generally, all eyes are on you. If you're naked in a room, everybody's pretty much looking at you, unless there's a dog, because
Yes.
a dog is, we always want to look at the animals in the room, particularly dogs if they're cute. So, you know, don't be naked with a dog is my advice. You know,
Unless you're nervous about it. Maybe
unless
that's
you're
the
nervous
way
about it. Yeah.
to start.
Yeah. Yeah. As if so. Or I guess like make the dog get naked with you, like shave the dog. I don't know, but only with their consent.
Well, we always talk about
Um,
when we take our, like my dog, when we take her collar off, you know, like then she's naked.
she's naked. Yeah, exactly. The little weird little like indentation in their
Yeah.
like
I'm
neck
wearing the
is a
collar
poor
too
thing.
much. Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think that there's a way in which, you know, and I think that one of the things that I love about performance is figuring out, and I think it's interesting in memoir too, figuring out how to find the most strength from the most vulnerable places. So to position, and I think that there is, when the more vulnerable you allow yourself to be, there is a strange sense of control that can come from that. It's You have to allow yourself to get to that vulnerable point, though, and that is an incredible act of trust, with yourself, with the world, with. But I think that there is that duality that exists.
Okay, so now I have to ask you, um, specifically about the performance where you interjected yourself into Marina Abramovich's performance at MoMA, because when you're talking about the vulnerability, um, of course, in her performance, and just to kind of like give the context to everyone, she was inviting anyone, it just had to form a line, but she was sitting in the museum in a chair, perfectly still and perfectly quiet, and you just sat across from her. And she would just remain still and quiet no matter what you did, no matter if you asked her questions or if I don't think you were supposed to touch her, but like, if you visually tried to like wave, like, hey, look at me, like she wouldn't change her. She would continue to just be very stoic and still. And anybody in the public could go be a part of it and sit in that chair. But when you were sitting in that chair, it was also your response as an artist, perhaps. So, anyway, I feel like it must have been very vulnerable to get in that line, knowing that you are going to do something different from what everyone is doing, that you are also going to be performing, and the vulnerability of, like, will you get kicked out? Like, will a security officer escort you away? Like, will Marina appreciate this or not? Like, that's very vulnerable.
Yeah, well, I want to clarify that you actually were not. So I spent some time studying the performance before I
Oh,
did it. So
okay, please.
studying the rules. So you were. I think you would have gotten kicked out if you were doing this or you spoke to her. So the rules sort of changed. I did it on the 10th day that it was open, and initially on the second day, somebody had been talking to her, and sort of somebody had another performance artist. I wasn't the first person to sort of interject a performance. Had asked her to marry, had proposed marrying the work of art that she was making. A little bizarre, but and so you were not allowed to talk to her.
Okay.
Was one of the rules. You're not allowed to talk to her. You were essentially supposed to sit still and be quiet and look at her. Those were the rules. And you also had to sign a photography waiver. You had to, so I knew that. I knew going in that I wasn't going to be performing any hijinks. Nor did I want to. What I really wanted, I mean, Marina is an incredibly important person in my artistic development. Certainly when I was investigating performance art, and certainly when I was thinking about that idea of vulnerability. I mean, there's no way that a young woman artist cannot pay attention to Marina, or somebody who's working with the body cannot pay attention to Marina and the work that she's done. And so, when I heard she was having a show, I was incredibly excited, incredibly curious. And so the work I made, where I sat across from her all day, dressed like her, I think that was meant as, but it was called, I called it the anxiety of influence. What was meant both as an homage to her, as like, I'm a mini me, like in my wildest fantasies, I'm a mini me of you, but also expressing some anger against the institution, which, she became the institution in that show. She became, she went from being, a extremely, probably one of the most highly regarded performance artists in the world, to the definition of performance art through that show. And so there was a lot of, tension about that. And I think for me, one of the things that was interesting, and that I would say a little bit proud of is the idea of a parasitical performance, or the idea of, and I think this gets to feminism and the structures that women in art do have to kind of partake in order to get their work out there, but being a little bit of a parasite on that performance. When was the next time that there's going to be a woman performance artist having a retrospective at MoMA? Well, I don't know. We haven't. We have Joan Jonas coming up. So that's been it's been 14 years. So the chances have been very, very slim for that. So I really wanted it to be something that was kind of like a little bit of a little bit of a love, a kiss, and a little bit of a like because I think that's how we view our elders, and that is, the title is from this Harold Bloom piece about, poets and the way that they look at the generation that comes before them, and thinking about the admiration you have, but also like an older sibling, the anger that you have at them, and the the feelings that you have, and that was what I wanted to do. And I'm very lucky that Marina, she had little hand signals that she could communicate to security guards if she was feeling uncomfortable. She could very easily have been like, "Get this girl out of here. She's a mess." So she rolled with it, and I'm very appreciative of that. So it was a fun day. It was a challenge. I was vulnerable in the sense that I was afraid that I might need to go to the bathroom. So I was vulnerable that way. But I think you also have to kind of have a pretty thick skin as a performance artist, especially if you're going to do public interventions, which that was, where you're going to get booed. You're going to get people throwing stuff at you. You're going to get people trying to interrupt you. That you're going to probably have some scuffle with the law at a certain point. I think those are all things that you kind of have to be aware of and have to be prepared for and not take personally. So.
Yeah. Speaking of having things thrown at you in a performance, there is one performance essay that I really loved, in which you had eggs thrown at you, and each egg represented the number of eggs that women's ovaries produce. Up to, I guess, was it your age at the time?
Yeah. It was how many eggs I had produced up until that time.
Yeah, I thought that was really clever. And I guess maybe it's because now I'm a woman, I'm not that old, but I am old enough to now be, look at, I'm in my late 30s and have not had a child yet, and am at a little bit of that crossroads in my life. So that one spoke to me.
Yeah, I think that the time when I made that was like the time when I made that I was in my early 30s, and I had just gone to a doctor's appointment where the doctor said, "So, do you want to have children?" And I was like, "Yes, I think. I don't know. I guess. Yes." And, was sort of he had a talk with me about, well, it's time to start thinking about that. And, what are you going to, these are different things. And, and it really was really, really on my mind. And I was thinking about also just the fact that everybody around me, it seemed to be my close friends, were starting to have, they were starting to have houses and getting pregnant, and that was like there was a lot of going to baby showers and things like that. And I was really, I think part of that piece was also the idea of being a woman, and the idea of there was a dance element in that piece as well. The idea of growing up and sort of what the expectations were. And one of the things that I think was, those 243 eggs were lobbed at me really hard. And I think that's an example in a piece where, the I was at like 20, and I was like, wow, That's really hurts. 20 eggs thrown at you actually really hurts. What is 243 going to be like? Where you're in the midst of a performance and you're like, because I don't rehearse. These aren't things that are rehearsed. These are actions that you're seeing the process of as they happen. And, can I get through this? Can I get through this? And yes, I'm going to have to get through this because people are looking at me now and there's a camera recording and I said I was going to do this, so I'm going to do this. But where you have that moment in performance where you're like, this is really I really did it. I did this to myself. I did this to myself. So and the next day and the days afterwards where I was like completely bruised all over myself, where was wearing protective goggles, where you're bumping into things and you're like, ow, ow, and you're like, I did this to myself. So, I mean, I think that I think that that brings up a lot of questions of when you're doing work with the body and performance. Frequently works with the body often do deal with some forms of self harm or deal with some forms of, you know, uh, revealing some type of pain or and I think that that's one of the things that can be an ethical question about performance is the idea of being an audience member and sort of being a witness to that. And to me, that's one of the fascinating things about performance is seeing that and what, the fact that I wasn't stopping and screaming at the people who were throwing at them, saying, "What are you doing? Stop doing that. Why are you throwing all these things at me?" I think, and that nobody in the audience got up and said, "What are you doing? Why are you throwing all these things?" So, you present all of these sort of power structures as to, and hierarchies, which I think is just a fascinating element of the environments that are created when performance is shown.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that when you're talking about, the display of pain, there's one involving a cactus. Um, there's another
Yes.
one, and I don't know if this was as painful, maybe, but with the salmon and blending it and drinking it, among other things that you did with this fish. So, like, can you talk a little bit more about your thought process behind some of those performances?
Yeah. Well, I would talk. I mean, I'll talk about the salmon. I think because it definitely definitely is an object of curiosity quite a bit. But the piece was that I have a 14-pound salmon, a quite large salmon, and I dance to it with to David Bowie's "Let's Dance," and I make out with it, and then I rip it up and I put it in a blender, and I make a smoothie out of it and I drink it. And this was part of a series I was doing where I was trying to make out with nature, which also is where the cactus comes from. Where I was doing all these interactions with animals in particular at that time, and thinking a lot about animals and humans, and thinking a lot about our relationship to the food chain, things like that. But the actual inspiration from that for that piece comes. A lot of people, their inspiration for making a piece might come from theory or might come from art historical record. For me, a lot of my inspiration comes from the 1970s and the types and popular culture around the time when I was born. And one of my favorite skits on Saturday Night Live has always been Dan Aykroyd's Bassomatic, which I don't know if you know, was where, if you're familiar with that skit.
I remember
But
Dan Aykroyd, but I always think of him as Coneheads. I don't. So
yes, he was very. Don't worry, the Conehead series will eventually make its way
yes,
series. But Bassmatic was just like it was like a parody commercial, which was just basically a blender where he stuck bass into a blender, and he
oh
and
yeah.
and it made bass in a blender, and he was at the end he said, I believe I might be getting the 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 catchline wrong, but at the end he said, "That's fantastic." And so I very, very much motivated by humor, and the things that I look to for my influences are very often physical comedy, are very often classic comedies, and certainly silent comedies. And so I just love that skit. I always loved it. It was one of my favorites growing up. And so I was driving and I was listening to Let's Dance, and I was thinking about Bassomatic, and I was like, gosh, that would be a great intro to. I was sort of picturing Dan Aykroyd sort of dancing around before the Bassomatic skit, like just kind of groove into David Bowie. And then I was like, oh, wouldn't that be awesome if it was me, but I had a salmon and it was gigantic? And so it was, so often ideas, and it's sort of like the Marina thing. I'm not somebody who comes to performance necessarily from, or I've never really traditionally been somebody who comes to it from I want to make a piece about climate change. And, I want to make a piece that's, very issues based. I come at it very instinctually in terms of something that intrigues me or an experience that I want to have, and that I would say this is not to downplay the subconscious level of I think what's going on in that piece, which is very much about the destruction of of which is very much about destruction, right? Which is very much also about you know making a connection with something, with the animal, making a connection with something that is an interspecies connection, loving it, becoming infatuated with it, having a sexual connection with it, and when I say sexual, I mean like not necessarily sex, but a sensory connection with it, and then destroying it. And so, I think at the subconscious, also the fact that it was a salmon was also about, female salmon swimming upstream, depositing their eggs and then dying. I think that all of that text is underneath there for me when I make a piece, but it's not conscious. Like I'm not like I need to make a piece about salmon because they swim upstream and then they die. Like it lives at a deeper layer for that. For me, I'm attracted to the comedic and the almost, I would say, the slightly entertaining value of it. I think that's sort of my just kind of predilection as somebody who grew up loving kind of wacky comedies.
Yeah.
So and I think performance art. I think performance art should be. Not should be. I don't want to say that, but I I do have a bit of a ham in me, and I like that.
Oh,
I like to take it out and show my ham off sometimes.
I think that's your next performance. The ham in
Right,
me.
the ham
The
in
ham in
me.
me.
The little can, the little canned ham coming out. Yeah, exactly.
But, I was going to ask you about your influences because we've talked about these very lofty women in art, like Martha Graham and Marina Abramovich. And then we talk about Dan Aykroyd and Saturday Night Live, but since it is Women's History Month, are there any other influences that you want to shout out, or other women working in art today who you'd love to share with others?
Oh yeah, I mean a tremendous number. I mean, I've speaking of Joan Jonas, whose retrospective is coming up at the MoMA. Very much, very Joan Jonas, Aiko, a lot of performance is really very important to me. So I would say Aiko. I would say that Buto, Japanese Buto, is something that's very important to me. I would say that I love Laurie Anderson. I love Meredith Monk. I love, reading, Elizabeth Hardwick is one of my favorites. So sort of a, so all over the map. Really, I think I'm also really into like painters like Philip Guston and Miro, and I still love photography. Justine Kurland, I was very lucky to have her as a TA when I was at Yale, and I love her photographs and more recently her collages. I still love black and white photography. I will say that I am. I can also say that as much as I am interested in, I love Andrea Modica. I love just this so many women. I was very lucky to have have that piece where I was weaving myself onto the back of the Miami Convention Center was briefly mentioned in Sheila Heti's first book, and
Oh,
just by total coincidence, and somebody read it and was like, "This sounds like something you would do," and I was like, "That is, in fact, me." So definitely a big fan definitely a big fan of her work. Definitely a big fan of Rachel Cusk, Rebecca Solnit. Really, there's and then certainly like. I mean, it just goes on and on. I really find that I mostly am looking at women in art these days, in literature and in visual art, visual and performance art.
well, there's one more woman we should be sure to talk about because she's a very important figure in your book, and it's your mama. So I want to make sure that we give her a shout out because she plays a very large role in, she's a recurring character in this book. And what do you want to share about her?
My mama was, she's no longer with us, but she was a real force of nature. I mean, she was, I think when I talk about, this duality of vulnerability and control and vulnerability and strength, I think that I'm probably talking about her. In many ways, she was the most vulnerable person I've ever met, and also the toughest. And she had a very, very tough life. She had a very tough life. She was raised in dire poverty, but was incredibly brilliant. And I think that, the book, when I think about to me, what the book is about, the book definitely talks about art and it talks about growing up in two different places. For me, the book was really about writing about my mother and my grandmother, and their legacy. And, I would say that the kind of impetus, the action of the story is really that, my mom, for a variety of reasons, leaving East Kentucky, and leaving the hills and leaving the mountains, and marrying my father, which, meant that I essentially was not raised during the year in East Kentucky. But I think the story really starts with the strength of my grandmother. And I don't want to, when I say strength, I don't want to, I want to be careful to say that, we have these depictions of strong hillbilly women, like in the Hillbilly Elegy film, like Glenn Close in the Hillbilly Elegy film. I think my grandmother she was tough. Like she was tough. But she was also incredibly loving. And, there are things that she did and bravery that she had that I don't know that I will ever be able to match. She, well into her 60s, well into, I guess it was in her mid 50s, somebody who never drove a car, somebody who had rarely ever left her holler, got on a plane by herself and flew to New York to, be there when I was born. So, things that, although they may seem very, well, what's the big deal about getting on a plane, to somebody who has, never been out of a very, very tiny little spit of land is a tremendous, achievement, really. So I think I get a lot of my sort of adventure and a lot of my sort of like, let's do it from my grandmother.
Yeah. And your mom's story is amazing too. I mean, at a young age, she decided, I want to join the Peace Corps.
Yeah, she did. Yeah, she was just like, I'm out of here. And she wanted to, and not only, again, my mom didn't just say, I'm going to Dayton, Ohio. Like I'm leaving East Kentucky. I'm going to Dayton, Ohio, or I'm going to Cincinnati. She was like, I'm going to East Africa. And she went to East Africa. So with the Peace Corps. So, I think we have a tendency on that side of the family to dream big, to dream, think the farthest away you can go. So, so that's, and I actually am, somebody who loves to travel as a solo female traveler, and I've been to 61 countries. So,
Wow.
so yeah, I'm somebody who's like, how far is this train going? Like, I'll go there. What's the last stop? So, and I think that sense of adventure comes from both of my Kentucky grandparents, but I would definitely say it comes from Mama. She was, she was a real force of nature, and she's very, very missed.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing her with us in your book. And thank you for sharing yourself and your story. So again, this is Holler Rat. This is Anya's memoir. And you can do it like me and listen to the audiobook as well and listen to Anya tell her own story. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
You're very welcome. I'm so excited that I had a chance to talk to you. And everybody go to Friendly City Books. They're really, I hopefully I'll get to come and visit in the next year. And I'm very excited to actually get to see you in person again.
Yeah, we can't wait. We would love to have you back in Mississippi. So for everyone who is listening, we just want to say happy reading.